Yeah, people. Got my drink offering going up. Burning some incense. Got prayers going out. What I'm going to be touching on is something that I touch on all the time. Who are God's people? All right? And the point I'm going to make, I try to keep it simple. I make quick notes, so it's kind of sporadic and not on one track, but it has the same purpose and direction, so bear with me. All right. So what I'm going to be talking about right now is, so there's only one Iran, one Iraq, one Israel, one Jerusalem, one Babylon, so on and so forth, etc. Okay? So why does the Bible leave directions for where those countries are? You know what I mean? The Israelites knew who the Egyptians were. They lived in close proximity to them. And the direction of Egypt from Israel would only be necessary if a foreigner was there and didn't know where Egypt was. But Israelites knew where Egypt was, so why was it pointed out exactly where these countries were located? For example, Moab was a country southeast of Israel. Okay, but over in Israel, they already knew that, Moab's right there. It's to the southeast. Why wouldn't they just say Moab? Why throw in the southeast of Israel? Why couldn't they just say in the land of Moab? Why would they have to? Okay, I'm going to touch on why I believe the directions were put there, and that's just for prophecy. So I can be here now saying to you, who are God's people? I believe the directions were left there for prophetic purposes. All right? God's people they lost everything. He turned his face from them, and they were left naked before the enemy. So what I'm saying is that Israel is not where most people believe it to be. It's almost the opposite. It says Egypt is southwest of Jerusalem. It's simple. Those in power control the eastern land to the southwest of Jerusalem, naming Egypt, and so on and so forth. All right, I'm getting into why I believe they've lied about who's God's people. They fought to take the land and create its history. Some countries, those with power, went along with the war plan. Most didn't. Most were killed or conquered, or the enemy's elected officials were put into power. And that's modern day, democracy. That'd be pretty easy. Just the elected officials work for the enemy. What I'm going to interject with here is that also, one thing that stood out to me as kind of strange is that the biblical map of the Grecian Empire, it spread over Jerusalem to the west, Jerusalem was part of the Grecian Empire. And in Joel 6, or Joel, the book of Joel, I believe it's 3:6, yes, it states about the enemy, and you have sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks in order to remove them far from their borders. How would that be selling them to the Greeks to remove them far from their border when A, the Grecian Empire went over where Jerusalem was located, and B, where does it say that Jews were being sold as slaves to the Greeks? That's interesting. And in fact, it says in the Bible that Israel is in the country of Assyria to this day. That's stated, to this day, until he returns them to their land. They're in the land of Assyria, still conquered. All right, but I'm going to get back to historically. My theory is not only possible, but plausible. Keep in mind, until the early 1900s, no one in America truly had interest in Egypt. besides the powers and their arms, which is science, anthropology, archaeology, geology, etc., all cohorting and calculating, meeting up, and they have formed an alliance against God and his appointed Christ. They have united the nations. All right, and isn't it strange that all artifacts made known to the public collude with written history? They don't tell us about what doesn't agree with history and scientific findings and such. They tell us what does agree. All right. It was all post-Civil War in America. In this land, it was, it was the idea of Egypt wasn't really a part of the American way of life. It was all, post-Civil War, England, France, and all those wars, Japan, civil rights, Native Americans. And also, it's interesting to note that Egypt was introduced visually, so to speak. Visually, Egypt was introduced to the American people via Hollywood. That's pretty interesting. And I believe it was a Laurel Hardy movie, I believe. So there's a predisposition for manipulation of ideas of Egypt. And soon we will know, ironically, Egypt is in California, Mexico area, that area. So enemies' humor with truth is mocked. Truth is mocked by that. But back to the point. Tell about the 1950s. Egypt wasn't on the world's mind. It was obscure. Let me say this again. Egypt, a powerful nation until the end, according to Scripture, was obscure until the 1950s. Egypt today is not very developed, not much industry really, still rough living really, civilized but not powerful. But Egypt is in end-time prophecies as being relied upon as a powerful ally who will fill the people of God. Egypt's not powerful today. And mind you, Egypt's embassy is in Mexico, or there is one in Mexico, which is interesting. But Israel established in the 1940s. Everybody knows that. So that was God's work. It's what we're led to believe. So I guess my next aim is to show how those Easterners aren't God's people. And here's my reasoning. The Jews over there, they're powerful. God's people are not. They're well respected and accepted. God's people are not. God's people are not in control in affecting what's happening on a world scale. The Jews are definitely involved in what's happening on a world scale. God's people are the helpless and victims surrounded by the enemy. Yes, some in the East are God's people, truly, of course, just not to the extent we are taught and led to believe. Judaism is the main belief system in Jerusalem and Israel. Is Judaism. Christians are still persecuted today, not only there but across the world, and mainly God's people not known to self until the end times or near once gathered. You can look at Jeremiah 31 for that's what I referenced as far as Scripture. Have we ever seen a flowing of every nation to Israel to become one of the chosen? Is there a recorded account of people from all over the world returning to eastern lands? When? Because if not, then Israel can't be established. A vast immigration swarm would have had to return from every nation first, millions and millions of them. Revelation states, and a vast crowd too large to count stood before the throne of God from every nation with palm branches in their hands, praising God. Not to mention Israel's population doesn't express that much diversity. There's not many nations living in Israel to this day. It's not diverse. It's not diverse. Look into how God's people were treated and their positions under Satan's rule. They are the blight of the earth, despised, sick, homeless, downtrodden, hated, etc. God said they were too good for this world. So how do the Eastern Jews compare to that? Do they match up? In your opinion? Do they match up in your opinion? That's what I was trying to ask. I was forming that into a question. And I don't see any similarities really, and I'm not anti-Jew or anything like that. just to be clear, I'm not anti-Jew. I'm pro-truth. No matter what the truth is, I only can try to convey it. No insults intended. I'm just being open to possibility and using faith in Scripture to search for the truth. Because whether we admit it, there's something huge not being told. And there's already so much information on the dealings and mindset of the Jewish people in the East today that points directly at something being just not right about what's being passed off as truth, at least in my opinion, about who God's people are. My point in all this, I am simply stating that it would have been very easy for those in power to fabricate history, then manipulate it accordingly. Remember how merciless and violent some of those Eastern nations were. They controlled dictation of Bible under penalty of death to disobey church. That's a fact. And killed any who stood in their way. Sounds like Satan conquering the land to set up the lie, then come attack God's people with the opposite of truth. America is where God's land is. That's overall something that I've expressed as my belief as the truth. So they come attack us with the lie as the truth. See, it's how it works. The enemy loves to mock God and his truth and his people. I can't explain my part any further. That's as far as I can go. And I hope that there's been some coherence to it. But like I said, the message came pretty sporadically and I had to burst it down. It ain't something I necessarily meditated upon or looked for any information or truth on it. It just comes to you. So I encourage anyone who opposed my view on this, go ahead and comment. Tell me why I'm wrong or how I went wrong. Point me in the right direction. But I'm going to say this. If you're not a believer in Jesus Christ, respect and peace to you, but I'm not going to consider what you believe. Just by saying it'd be better to match Scripture. If you're a believer and you're going to convince me that those people over there are the Jews, it better match Scripture. But at the same time, it better not match my theory, which is all they did was take the land and say, okay, Egypt is south of Jerusalem. So here's Egypt, south of Jerusalem, in Babylon, and so on and so forth. So you're going to have to convince me outside of my own theory too, because that's the truth. You're going to have to come at me with the straight up truth. You can't use the history of those nations as they've written it. You have to come up with your own theory like I did and use Scripture to back you up. And I'll stop by saying this. And there are those who call themselves Jews, but are not. In fact, they are the synagogue of Satan. And a synagogue, I would believe, means the church of the enemy. God bless.